This is your need to know. This is your need to know.
Welcome to our deep dive into the Bracero program.
It's a fascinating program.
You've given us a great set of sources to work with here.
Yeah.
We've got academic articles and even some song lyrics.
Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, so we're going to try to trace this program's impact all the way from its roots in the early 20th century
Okay.
up to today.
That's good.
We're going to go chronologically through time
Right.
and see how this guest worker program evolved
Okay.
and left its mark on the U.S. and Mexico.
It's amazing how much this program still resonates today
Yeah.
in our current debates about immigration.
Especially considering it lasted from 1942 to 1964.
Right.
But before we get into the program itself,
Okay.
let's rewind even further.
All right.
Our sources point to the early 1900s,
Uh-huh.
a time when Mexican migration to the U.S.
Right.
was already significant.
Exactly.
The Bracero program didn't just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, you see economic disparities pushing Mexicans northward.
I see.
And at the same time, better wages in the U.S. were pulling them in.
Interesting.
And it's fascinating
Yeah.
that this early migration wave actually sparked a debate within Mexico itself.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well,
It's interesting to me that Mexico initially discouraged emigration,
yeah.
even though their people were clearly seeking better opportunities elsewhere.
It shows how complex of a situation governments face.
Yeah.
They saw a need for labor at home
Right.
to help fuel their own development.
Right.
But they couldn't ignore the economic realities driving people across the border.
That makes sense.
It's a tension that many countries grapple with even today.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It really is.
It shows how deeply intertwined these economic and social forces are
Yeah,
when it comes to migration.
for sure.
But then World War II comes along
Right.
and throws a wrench into everything.
Uh-huh.
Suddenly it's 1942, and the U.S. is facing this massive labor shortage.
Yeah, American men are being drafted left and right.
And this is where the Bracero program is born. The U.S. and Mexico formally agreed to this temporary worker program,
Right.
primarily to fill the agricultural labor gap
Uh-huh.
left by the war.
Yeah, it was a strategic partnership,
Okay.
driven by the U.S. needing workers and Mexico hoping that the returning braceros would contribute to their own post-war development.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay.
What were the specific guarantees made to these Mexican workers?
Yeah, what about them?
I'm really curious about the wages and working conditions.
Well, on paper, it seemed pretty decent.
Okay.
They were assured decent living conditions,
Okay.
a minimum wage,
Uh-huh.
although is only 30 cents an hour to start,
Wow.
and protection from discrimination and forced military service.
Okay.
They were even supposed to have a portion of their wages put into a Mexican bank account
Oh, wow.
for when they eventually returned.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it suggests they didn't want these workers to be entirely uprooted
Right.
and that they'd benefit financially from their time in the U.S.
That's a good idea.
It speaks to Mexico's longer-term vision for the program.
Okay.
They saw returning braceros as potential agents of industrialization,
I see.
bringing back skills and capital to boost their own economy.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But as we know, the reality on the ground
Uh-huh.
often deviates from even the best laid plans.
Oh, for sure.
And our sources hint at some darker aspects of the Bracero program.
Right.
It wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it?
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
And while the program initially focused on agriculture,
Okay.
it quickly expanded to include railroad workers,
Oh, wow.
who were vital to the wartime effort.
Right.
And as the program grew, so did the stories of exploitation and abuse.
Our sources mentioned some pretty grim examples.
Yeah, like what?
Well, there's an account of a Bracero camp that suffered a mass food poisoning incident.
Oh, wow.
And there were stories of workers stuffing rocks in sacks to boost their weight-based pay.
It's horrible.
Yeah, it paints a very different picture
It does.
from those initial promises
Yeah.
of decent treatment.
This is where the program's contradictions really start to surface.
Okay.
Despite agreements to protect them,
Yeah.
braceros often found themselves trapped in a system that prioritized cheap labor over their well-being.
It's sad to think about.
It is.
And it wasn't just individuals being mistreated.
Right.
There were also instances of blatant discrimination.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I was really struck by the mention of segregated camps
Yeah.
with separate facilities for white, Black, and Mexican laborers.
This brings us to a truly disturbing aspect of the program's legacy.
What's that?
The use of that derogatory term wetback.
Right.
It shows how ingrained prejudice was within the system.
It's awful.
And how this language was used to dehumanize and marginalize Mexican workers.
It's heartbreaking to think that these workers who are contributing so much
I know.
to the U.S. economy were being subjected to such blatant racism.
It's awful.
The disrespect.
It speaks volumes about the power dynamics at play.
Yeah.
The Bracero program, despite its initial intentions,
ultimately became a system that allowed for the exploitation of a vulnerable workforce.
And this exploitation was fueled by prejudice?
Sadly, yes.
And disregard for basic human rights?
It's true.
Okay, so that's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But it's important to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths
I agree.
as we try to understand the Bracero program.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that even programs designed with good intentions can have unintended consequences,
They can.
especially when they intersect with social inequalities.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so we've talked about the program's inception
Right.
during wartime
Uh-huh.
and its expansion and the backlash.
Right.
But our original question
Yeah.
focused on the Bracero program's legacy
Uh-huh.
and its connection to modern-day America.
Okay.
So what threads can we trace
Yeah, good question.
from this program to the immigration debates we see unfolding today?
That's where the real deep dive begins.
Okay.
We've laid the historical foundation. Now let's layer on the contemporary context.
This Bracero program wasn't just a self-contained event.
Right.
It was a chapter in a much larger story.
Okay.
The story of migration labor and the evolving relationship between the U.S. and Mexico.
That's interesting.
And that story is still being written today.
Wow.
Yeah. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, I will.
This is your need to know. This is your need to know. This is your need to know. This is your need to know.
We left off last time talking about some of the darker parts of the Bracero program.
Yeah, the exploitation and discrimination.
Right, and even the dehumanizing language used against Mexican workers.
Oh, it's wetback.
Exactly.
Thoughtful.
But our sources reveal that this wasn't the whole story,
Right. There was pushback and resistance.
and ultimately a reckoning
Yeah.
with the program's flaws.
Wasn't a monolith. You know,
Yeah.
there were voices inside and outside the system that were
Yeah.
challenging these injustices.
So let's dig into that.
Okay.
What were some of the key turning points
Yeah.
that led to the program's end in 1964?
Well, our sources mention labor union activism
Okay.
and concerns about the program's impact on domestic workers, as well as just growing public awareness.
Of the program's shortcomings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The 1950s saw the rise of a powerful force,
Who was that?
the United Farm Workers,
Okay.
led by Cesar Chavez.
Right.
And they fought for better working conditions for domestic farm workers,
Okay.
many of whom felt displaced
Right.
or undercut by the Bracero program.
That makes sense.
And their fight gained momentum
Ah.
and put a lot of pressure on the system.
It's interesting how a program meant to address a labor shortage
Right.
ended up fueling a movement for workers' rights.
It is interesting.
Did the United Farm Workers achieve any lasting changes?
Yeah, they did.
Like what?
They really pushed for better conditions for agricultural workers.
Okay.
They forced the recognition of collective bargaining rights,
Okay.
secured minimum wage increases,
Good for them.
and shed light on the horrible conditions many farm workers faced.
Yeah,
It's a testament to the power of organized labor and social movements
I agree.
to challenge injustice.
That's so true.
It is.
It's a powerful reminder that change doesn't happen overnight.
No, it does.
It takes dedicated individuals
Right.
and collective action
Yeah,
to push for progress.
absolutely.
What about those concerns regarding domestic workers?
Right.
Was that a significant factor in the program's end?
It was.
Okay.
Labor unions were very vocal critics of the Bracero program.
Okay, what were they saying?
They argued that it depressed wages
Okay,
and displaced American workers.
that makes sense.
And this resonated with certain segments of the public
Mm-hmm.
and just added fuel to the fire.
So it seems like the Bracero program was caught in this crossfire?
It was.
On the one hand, you have this need for agricultural labor,
Right.
and the program provides a way to meet that need.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Mm.
you have these concerns about exploitation
Right.
and discrimination
Yeah.
and the displacement of American workers.
It's tough.
It's complicated.
It is.
There's no easy answers.
Not at all.
And that complexity is reflected in the variety of responses we see.
Okay.
Alongside this push for reform and worker protection,
Uh-huh.
we also see mechanization emerging.
Right.
Faced with losing the bracero labor,
Yeah.
some farmers turn to technology
They do.
and invest in machinery.
Right. To replace human hands in the fields.
Wow.
Yeah.
That raises a whole new set of questions.
It does.
Did mechanization benefit farm workers in the long run,
Right.
or did it just lead to fewer jobs?
It's a tough question.
It's almost like a technological echo of the bracero program,
It is, in a way.
with its own benefits and drawbacks.
Yeah, it's a point of contention even today.
Really?
Yeah, some argue that mechanization,
Mm-hmm.
while displacing workers in the short term,
Right.
ultimately improved working conditions
Okay.
and reduced the need for low-wage labor.
I see.
But others say that it made farm work even more physically demanding
Right.
and contributed to the decline of rural communities.
Interesting.
It's complicated.
Right.
It really highlights those unintended consequences of progress,
It does.
especially when it comes to labor markets
Right.
and social structures.
Yeah. Progress doesn't always equal a better life for everyone.
It doesn't.
But while the bracero program itself ended,
Uh-huh.
its influence
Right.
on American society,
Yeah.
and especially the immigration landscape,
Yeah.
was far from over.
It wasn't.
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
We've gone from the program's inception
Right.
during wartime
Uh-huh.
to its expansion and the backlash.
Yeah.
But our original question
Right.
focused on the program's legacy
Uh-huh.
and its connection to modern-day America.
Right.
So what threads can we trace from this program
Yeah, what about it?
to the immigration debates happening today?
That's the real deep dive.
Okay.
We have the historical foundation.
Right.
Now let's add on the modern context.
Right.
The Bracero program wasn't just a standalone event.
Right.
It was a chapter in a much larger story, the story of migration labor and the evolving relationship between the U.S. and Mexico.
Interesting.
And that story is still being written today.
So are we basically repeating history?
Well, it's tempting to draw a straight line,
Yeah.
but the reality is more nuanced than that.
Okay.
There are echoes of the Bracero program in today's policies,
Uh-huh.
but the context has shifted.
Okay.
And so have the programs themselves.
Well, give me an example.
The H-2A visa, for example,
Okay.
has stricter requirements
Okay.
for employers.
Like what?
Well, they have to provide housing and transportation
Okay.
and guarantee a minimum wage that's tied to local rates.
Those sound like positive steps.
They do.
But are these protections actually enforced?
Right. Good question.
Our sources pointed out that the lack of oversight
Yeah.
was a big contributor to the Bracero program's problems.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Enforcement is key.
Right.
And it's where even well-intentioned programs can fail.
Okay.
There have been cases of wage theft. Yeah. Unsafe working conditions.
Wow.
And even retaliation against workers who speak out.
That's awful.
Yeah, it happens under the H-2A program
Wow.
and in broader agricultural labor practices.
So it sounds like the potential for exploitation still exists,
It does.
even with safeguards in place.
Yeah.
Is it just a matter of strengthening enforcement,
Well,
or are there deeper problems?
it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Improving enforcement is crucial.
Right.
But we also need to acknowledge those power imbalances
Right.
that are inherent in these systems.
Yeah.
Migrant workers,
Uh-huh.
especially undocumented ones,
Right.
are often in very vulnerable positions,
Okay.
which makes it difficult to assert their rights
I see.
or fight back against abuse.
So we're back to that question
Yeah,
of balancing the need for labor
right.
with the protection of workers' rights,
Exactly.
regardless of their immigration status.
What's at the heart of the issue?
It's a tough one.
It is.
And it's still being debated in America today.
Yeah, there are no easy answers.
That's for sure.
But maybe the most valuable lesson from the Bracero program
Yeah.
is that ignoring history can lead to repeating its mistakes.
Right.
By studying the past, understanding it,
Yeah.
and talking about it openly,
Right.
we can hopefully chart a better path forward.
That's a powerful thought
It is.
to carry with us as we wrap up our deep dive. So we've gone through this whole journey,
We have,
the rise and fall of the Bracero program.
yeah, all its complexities and contradictions.
And we've seen how a program designed to address a wartime labor shortage
Right.
turned into something so much bigger,
It did.
with these huge repercussions for the U.S. and Mexico.
It's a good reminder
Yeah.
that even well-intentioned policies can have these unintended consequences.
They can.
Especially when they're tied up with things like economic disparity
Yeah.
and social injustice and
Right.
just deep-seated prejudice.
It's like holding up a mirror
Yeah.
to American society, revealing both its strengths and flaws.
Absolutely.
But our deep dive isn't over yet.
Right. We still need to connect all this back to you, the listener,
Exactly.
and what you can take away from exploring the Bracero program.
We've unearthed all this information,
We have.
but information alone isn't really enough.
It's not.
So what are the key insights
Yeah. What about them?
you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, first, I hope they understand that immigration is not a new thing.
Right.
It's been a constant in American history,
It has.
shaped by economic forces,
Right.
political decisions,
Yeah.
and social attitudes.
Okay.
And the Bracero program is just one chapter in a much longer story
Look-
that's still being written today.
It's a good point. It's a
Yeah.
reminder that history doesn't just happen.
No.
It's made through choices,
Yeah.
actions, and even inaction.
Right.
And those choices have consequences
They do.
that can last for generations.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my second point.
Okay.
There are no easy answers to complex issues like immigration.
Right.
You know, these simple answers, often driven by fear or prejudice,
Yeah.
they tend to just ignore the human cost
Right.
and the long-term implications. And the Bracero program, with all its nuances and unintended consequences,
Yeah.
is a perfect example of that.
It reminds me of that saying,
Which one?
for every complex problem,
Uh-huh.
there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I like that one.
It's so tempting to grasp at those simple answers.
It is.
But history teaches us to be cautious.
It does.
So my third takeaway,
Okay.
and this is maybe the most important one,
Right.
is that history matters.
I agree.
You know, understanding the past,
Yeah.
even its uncomfortable truths,
Uh-huh.
can help us make better decisions today.
It can.
It lets us see patterns
Right.
and recognize those potential pitfalls
Uh-huh.
and hopefully avoid repeating the same mistakes.
It's about learning from the past,
Yeah,
not being trapped by it.
exactly.
The Bracero program,
Yeah.
for all its complexities,
Right.
offers us a way to look at current debates about immigration,
It does.
labor rights,
Yeah.
and even what it means to be American.
And it helps us ask better questions.
Like what?
Like, how can we create immigration policies that are good for the economy,
Right.
but also protect people's basic human dignity?
That's a good question.
How can we make sure workers are protected from exploitation,
Yeah.
no matter their immigration status?
It's important.
How can we move past all the divisive rhetoric
Uh-huh.
and have a real conversation
A real conversation.
about immigration
Yes.
that's based on facts and compassion?
It's what we need.
These are questions for everyone to think about,
They are.
not just politicians and academics.
That's right.
We all have a part to play
We do?
in shaping a future
Right.
where we learn from the past
I agree.
and make better choices today.
That's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning new facts.
Right.
It's about thinking critically
Uh-huh.
and being empathetic
Yeah.
and ultimately giving you the tools to participate in these conversations.
In a meaningful way.
Exactly.
I think that's a great place to wrap up.
It is.
Our deep dive has taken us on quite a journey.
It has.
We've talked about history,
Yeah.
economics, social justice,
Right.
even human psychology.
The all connected.
But the journey doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
We encourage you to keep learning about this topic.
Yeah,
Seek out different perspectives
absolutely.
and have those thoughtful conversations about immigration
Yeah,
and its impact on our world.
because understanding the past
Yeah.
is not just about looking back.
Right.
It's about looking ahead with more awareness
Right.
and with a commitment
Okay.
to building a more just and equal future.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive
Of course.
into the Bracero program.
It was my pleasure.
We hope it's made you curious
Yeah,
and left you with some questions to ponder.
because the best deep dives
Yeah.
were the ones that make you want to keep learning.
That's right. Thanks for listening.
This is your need to know.